Imagine you wake up one morning and something feels wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just off. A slight headache, a stiffness in your neck. You felt worse before, so you get up, you get dressed, you start your day. But by mid-morning, you notice something under your arm. A small lump. Hard, tender when you press it. By noon, it's the size of a walnut. By late afternoon, the size of an egg. The skin around it is pulling tight, turning dark. Your fever is climbing so fast, the room won't stop moving. Your whole body aches in a way you've never felt before, deep in the bones, like something is wrong at a level you can't reach. Your family sees it. They know what it is. They've seen it on neighbors, on the family down the street that was fine last week and is gone this week. They lock the door, not to keep you in, to keep themselves out. A cloth is stuffed under the gap. A cross is chalked on the wood. And you are alone, somewhere outside. Footsteps echo on the cobblestones. A slow, deliberate walk, and then a knock. When the door opens, you see a figure that looks nothing like a man. A long black coat, stiff and waxy, reaching the floor. Gloves, a wide-brimmed hat, glass circles where the eyes should be, and a long, narrow beak, like a giant bird, protruding from where the face should be. This is the plague doctor. In the 14th century, this was the last face most people ever saw. Today, we go inside that mask. Who were these men? Where did they come from? What did they actually do in those rooms? And how many of them made it out alive? Because the real story of the plague doctor is far stranger, far darker, and far more human than anything you've seen in a movie or a video game. To understand the plague doctor, you have to understand the scale of what they were walking into. Because it's very easy to hear the number 25 million dead and let it pass over you as an abstraction. It isn't. Let me make it concrete. The year is 1347, October. A fleet of 12 Genoese trading ships arrives at the port of Messina in Sicily, returning from the Black Sea trade routes. The port authorities come to meet them, and what they find stops them cold. Most of the sailors are dead. The ones still alive are covered in enormous black swellings, in the groin, in the armpits, at the neck, oozing blood and pus. The men are delirious with fever. Their skin is mottled and dark. They smell of rot while still alive. The authorities immediately order the ships out of the harbor, get them away from the city, burn them if necessary. But it's already too late. The rats have already left the ships, and the fleas on those rats are already in the city. Within weeks, people in Messina are dying. Within months, the disease is in mainland Italy. By early 1348, it's in France, in Spain, moving up through Germany toward the north. By 1349, it reaches England. By 1351, it's in Scandinavia and Russia. Everywhere it goes, the pattern is the same. First a few deaths, then dozens. Then the bodies can't be collected fast enough. In Florence, one of the most populous and wealthy cities in Europe at the time, the writer Giovanni Boccaccio watches it happen from the inside. He later describes neighbors abandoning neighbors, parents abandoning children, children abandoning parents. He describes bodies left in the streets because there's nobody left to carry them. He describes pigs rooting through abandoned houses and dying within hours from contact with the infected clothing inside. He describes a city that within the span of months has lost the basic architecture of human society. Not just people, but the rules, the obligations, the structures that hold people together. By 1353, when the first major wave of the Black Death begins to recede, somewhere between 30 and 60% of Europe's entire population is dead. The range is wide because in many places, there's nobody left to count. Some villages in France and England simply disappear from historical record. Not destroyed, not abandoned in an organized way, just gone, swallowed back by the landscape. And in the middle of all of this, someone has to do something. The problem is that nobody knows what they're dealing with. There is no germ theory. Bacteria won't be observed for another 300 years. The dominant medical understanding of disease in the 14th century is the miasma theory, the idea that illness is caused by bad air. Rotting organic matter, swamp gas, the stench of death. Breathe it in, and the corrupted air corrupts your body. It's wrong, completely wrong. but it is the framework within which every plague doctor will operate. And so, city by city across Europe, local governments begin making a decision. They create a new kind of official position, a doctor contracted specifically to treat plague victims, paid not by the patient because the patients are dying and their families are in chaos, but by the city itself. A salary, a contract, sometimes housing, sometimes bonuses. These are the first plague doctors. And here's the thing that most people don't know, that most histories gloss over, because it changes everything about how you understand this figure. The majority of plague doctors hired during the Black Death had little or no formal medical training, and the city councils that hired them knew this perfectly well and hired them anyway. When a city needed a plague doctor, it issued a public contract. And you might imagine that the finest physicians in Europe would be competing for these positions. In reality, the opposite was true. The finest physicians in Europe had already left. This is one of the most uncomfortable and least discussed aspects of the Black Death. The moment plague arrived in a city, the wealthy departed, and that included most of the trained medical professionals. They loaded their belongings onto carts. They called in favors to get past the city gates, and they rode for country estates and mountain villages where the population density was low and the chance of infection was smaller. Some city governments tried to stop them. Venice passed laws forbidding physicians from leaving under penalty of massive fines. Certain Italian city-states threatened physicians with permanent exile if they abandoned their patients. Some of these laws worked, most didn't. A man faced with near certain death has a high tolerance for legal consequences. What remained in the cities were the men willing to stay. Some of them were genuine physicians, men with university training in Salerno or Bologna or Paris, who felt that their medical oath bound them to their patients regardless of the risk. These men are the most admirable figures in this story, and also some of the most tragic. Guy de Chauliac, the personal physician to Pope Clement VI in Avignon, is the most famous of them. He stayed. He treated patients throughout the outbreak of 1348. He contracted plague himself and survived, which was unusual enough that he documented the experience in detail. His medical writings from this period are some of the most valuable primary sources we have. But men like de Chauliac were the exception. The contracts issued by cities like Venice, Genoa, Cologne, and London were answered by a much more varied group. Some were barber surgeons, a profession several rungs below that of a physician in the hierarchy. Vol medical hierarchy. Barbers performed bloodletting, pulled teeth, lanced boils. They were not considered doctors, but they were willing to work. Some were men with no medical training at all, simply people who had watched enough illness, who had perhaps assisted a physician before, who knew the vocabulary and could perform the rituals of examination. The city of Venice in 1348 is documented to have contracted at least one plague doctor, whose previous occupation was unclear and whose credentials could not be verified. He was foreign, possibly German, and the city hired him because he was there, and he said he would go into the houses. The motivation varied. Some were driven by genuine duty, some by deep religious faith, a belief that they were doing God's work and that God would therefore protect them, or that dying in service was a form of martyrdom. And some, perhaps more than we'd like to admit, were motivated primarily by money. The pay was significant. A plague doctor's contract in a major Italian city during the Black Death could be worth several times what a normal physician earned in a year. Housing was often provided free of charge. Some contracts included a bonus structure based on number of patients seen. For a man with few prospects, a young physician with no established practice, a surgeon from a lower-class family, a foreigner with no connections, the plague doctor's salary was extraordinary. And then, having hired these men, the cities gave them a uniform. The image is one of the most recognizable in all of history. The long dark coat, the wide-brimmed hat, the gloves, the glass eye holes, and above all, the beak. That long, narrow, slightly curved protrusion that makes the figure look not quite human, not quite animal, something in between. Here is something that will fundamentally change how you see this image. The iconic beaked plague doctor costume, the one you know from paintings, games, carnival masks, was not used during the Black Death of 1347. It didn't exist yet. It was designed nearly 300 years later. The original plague doctors walked into those houses wearing far less protection. And when you understand what they were actually wearing, their situation becomes even more terrifying. The famous beaked costume was designed in 1619, 272 years after the Black Death, by a French physician named Charles Delorme, who served at the courts of several European monarchs, including Louis XIII, to Europe multiple times, and Delorme decided to engineer a systematic solution. His design was, for its time, genuinely sophisticated. It was the first serious attempt in history at what we would today call personal protective equipment. The coat was made of heavy canvas or leather, both materials then coated in wax. The wax was intended to repel the miasmatic bad air, to create an impermeable barrier between the doctor's skin and the diseased environment. It covered the entire body from neck to ankle with no gaps. Gloves of the same waxed material, boots that came up to the knee, a wide-brimmed hat, a practical signal of official status, recognizable from a distance, and over the eyes, glass lenses set in a leather frame, sealing completely against the face. The beak was the centerpiece. It was hollow, a chamber roughly the length of a hand, and packed with a mixture of aromatic substances: dried flowers, roses, carnations, lavender, herbs, mint, camphor, calamus root, spices, cloves, cinnamon, sometimes laudanum, an opium compound, sometimes myrrh, sometimes vinegar-soaked sponges. The theory, consistent with miasma belief, was that these strong-smelling substances would neutralize the corrupt air before it reached the doctor's lungs. Breathe through the beak, and the beak filters the poison out. This was wrong. Herbs cannot filter bacteria. The plague was spread by flea bites, and in its pneumonic form, through respiratory droplets, not by bad air in any meaningful sense. And yet, here's the strange irony. The costume accidentally worked, not against plague specifically, but against several of the vectors of transmission. A body completely enclosed in heavy waxed cloth was dramatically harder for fleas to bite through. Fleas cannot easily penetrate that material. The glass goggles prevented direct eye contact with droplets. The gloves prevented skin contact with patients. By accident, while trying to block a threat that didn't exist in way they imagined, Delorme's doctors were blocking several of the real threats. The doctors of 1347, of course, had none of this. They improvised, a waxed cloak if they had one, a cloth soaked in vinegar pressed against the face, a bundle of herbs held up to the nose. Some wore wooden masks, crude, non-sealing, more symbolic than functional. They walked into rooms full of dying people, and they did what they could with what they had. So the doctor is in the room with you. What happens? The examination begins. He looks at the buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that give bubonic plague its name, from the Greek bubon, meaning groin. He checks under your arms, in the groin, at the sides of your neck. He notes their size, their color, whether they're hard or soft, fixed or movable. He examines your tongue, coated and dark in plague patients. He notes the color of your urine, collected in a flask. He takes your pulse. He looks at the whites of your eyes. This examination is largely theatrical in the sense that it doesn't change what he does next, because there is only one playbook, and every doctor runs the same one. The treatments used by plague doctors weren't just ineffective. Several of them actively accelerated death, and the doctors administering them had no way of knowing this. The first and most common intervention was lancing the buboes, cutting them open with a blade, sometimes a scalpel, sometimes simply a sharp knife, and draining the fluid within. In some cases, this provided genuine temporary relief. The pressure of a fully swollen bubo is agonizing, and draining it removed that specific pain. Occasionally, a patient whose bubo was drained in the early stages of infection survived. This gave the procedure a reputation it didn't entirely deserve. The problem was the blade. Medical instruments in the 14th century were not sterilized between patients. The concept of sterilization didn't exist. A doctor who lanced a bubo and then moved to the next patient was transferring infected material directly. He was a vector. He was, unknowingly, helping the disease travel faster through a population. Other treatments were applied around the buboes themselves. Live chickens were held against the swellings, the theory being that the animal's warmth and vitality would draw the poison out through the skin. When the chicken died, which it sometimes did, possibly from the stress, possibly from direct contact with infected tissue, it was considered evidence that the method was working. The poison was transferring. Another chicken was brought in. Onions were rubbed on the skin. Arsenic compounds were applied topically and sometimes ingested. Mercury, deeply toxic, was prescribed in various forms. Treacle, a thick medicinal syrup descended from ancient Greek formulas, was given as a drink. One widely circulated remedy from this period recommends that patients consume a mixture of 10-year-old treacle, powdered eggshell, and marigold flowers, and then sweat overnight under heavy blankets. Bloodletting was standard. Open a vein, usually in the arm, and drain blood into a bowl. This was the era's universal response to almost any serious illness, based on the theory of humoral medicine that disease resulted from an imbalance of the body's four humors. Draining blood rebalanced the humors. Applied to plague patients who were already feverish, dehydrated, and in systemic shock, aggressive bloodletting killed people who might otherwise have had a chance. One documented remedy, recorded in a Flemish medical text from 1349, instructs the doctor to have the patient sit in a sewer, reasoning that since miasma caused plague and sewers contained the worst possible air, this extreme exposure would somehow cauterize or overwhelm the disease. There is no record of whether anyone tried this. There is also no record of it working. What the plague doctor actually contributed, without knowing it, in Venice, Ragusa, and several other Italian city-states, plague doctors were required to record every patient they visited. Name, neighborhood, symptoms, date. When patients died, they certified the cause. These records, imperfect, incomplete, biased, are the first systematic disease surveillance records in European history. City councils use this data to make decisions: close a neighborhood, restrict movement, burn contaminated goods. It was Venice, using its plague doctors' reports, that invented the practice of quarantine. Ships arriving from infected ports were required to anchor offshore for 30 days initially, later extended to 40. Quarantina, in Italian, the origin of our word. If nobody on board showed symptoms after 40 days, they could enter the city. This was entirely empirical. They didn't know why it worked, only that it did. It was one of the most effective public health interventions in medieval history, and it emerged directly from the data that plague doctors were collecting. The last question is the one that sits heaviest. How many of them died? Precise numbers are impossible. Records from this period are fragmentary. Cities that lost their clerks, their priests, their officials in the epidemic also lost the administrative capacity to track what happened to individual contractors. But what we do know is enough. Venice lost at least 2 contracted plague doctors during the 1348 outbreak. Their names appear in contract records and then simply stop. The city of Catania, in Sicily, lost multiple medical personnel within weeks of the epidemic's arrival. In Paris, entire faculties of the medical university were decimated. Some towns put out contracts for plague doctors and received no responses at all. Nobody willing to take the job at any price. Several cities, anticipating this, wrote pension clauses into plague doctor contracts. If the contracted physician died in service, his widow and children would receive a fixed annual payment from the city treasury. This was not standard practice for any other municipal employee of the period. The cities knew what they were asking. They wrote the death benefit into the contract because they expected to pay it. Some doctors left written records. De Caliac's account is the most detailed. He describes contracting plague, lying in his chamber for 6 weeks, surviving on sheer stubbornness and what he calls divine mercy. He describes the psychological weight of watching colleagues die around him. He describes the temptation to flee and his decision to stay in terms that feel startlingly modern, like something a doctor might write today. Others left nothing. Their names on contracts that were never renewed because there was no one left to renew them. And here is where I want to leave you. These men, trained or not, heroic or simply desperate, motivated by duty or money or religious conviction or simple stubbornness, walked every day into the worst places in the world, into rooms that smelled of death, into houses where everyone inside was already dying, carrying tools that didn't work, wearing protection that was insufficient, working from a theory of disease that was completely wrong. They went anyway. The beak mask became the enduring image of the plague doctor, not just because it looks striking, not just because it's visually distinctive. It became the symbol because it captures something true about what these men were. Inhuman enough in appearance to walk into places no ordinary person would enter, but human enough, unmistakably, uncomfortably human, to knock on the door and try. He couldn't cure the plague. He almost certainly couldn't save the person lying in that room. The herbs in his beak were useless. The blade he carried would do as much harm as good. He didn't know any of this. Or perhaps some of them did know or suspected, and they went in anyway. In the middle of the worst demographic catastrophe in European history, the plague doctor showed up. And sometimes, in history and in life, that is the only thing left to do. There are more stories like this one. People you've never heard of, doing things you can't imagine, in conditions you wouldn't survive. That's what this channel is for. Subscribe, and we'll see you in the past.